it's interesting that the whole debate about the future of Scotland is now getting much more international attention, particularly Spain, but I think in the States, perhaps more on defence issues and the implications there, the Canadians as well. And I think that's appropriate because if Scotland does secede, then in effect the world's oldest democratic multinational state would have dissolved. There are all sorts of issues then about what type of structures would succeed them, and I'm sure there would be structures of a confederal sort that would keep a lot of Britishness going, and there would be cooperation. But it would send a signal, I think, to the world that perhaps wasn't sent when Yugoslavia or even the Soviet Union dissolved. And I think it's appropriate to put this debate in that context. It affects options that unionists would develop, and it also affects, I think, the options that nationalists are looking at. It is not just the people of Scotland's decision. They will determine what happens to Britain. We need a voice in that. But the whole British people, in conducting themselves on this big constitutional issue in the next year, will have a big impact on worldwide constitutionalism. This is going to be the biggest decision since 1998, when the High Court of the Supreme Court of Canada ruled on the principle of secession and basically said there wasn't a right to secede, but that there was a presumption to negotiate if the people of Quebec voted for independence. We obviously would have taken things on quite considerably if we do see Scotland leave the Union. And I think, as far as the whole concept of unionism, it will be the biggest event, if that happens, probably since the American Civil War, in which the very term unionism was coined incidentally. And I think this sense of unionism, it's, perhaps some of you feel I've started off in quite a high-handed way that puts the nationalist case in a poor light, but I don't at all. I think it's a coherent option. And a perfectly permissible one, and a liberal one, if I can put it that way. But I think the consequences need to be thought about. But for unionists, I think to have a unionism that is insular to Britain causes its own difficulties. European unionism, I think, is something that has to be taken very seriously. And how you have one without the other, well, I think you need to present an argument to show that that's coherent. And the unionists clearly have to consider developing a constitution and looking at some issues if we really want to keep the union together. And it is not going to survive on sufferance. It's not going to survive there if the English really don't want to pay the price for a union, just as the people of Scotland and Wales pay a price in not having independence. Finally, Britain clearly is at the moment a quasi-federal state. But we have federalism without the rule book. That's how I would describe it. And it occurs to me that one way out of our present difficulties, if you're a unionist, is to have a fuller, well-thought-out form of federalism for the British, to match and meet the needs of British political experience, but to have a rule book. And we can talk about how we may get there, but to say we need a more formal federal settlement that recognises the sovereign authority of Wales, Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, and also of the UK state, and to look at our other institutions in those terms as well, particularly, for instance, the House of Lords, but there are issues about how England is governed in terms of domestic matters, and how the UK government would survive as a powerful and authoritative government with other sovereign governments around it. And I think those are very, very complex issues that need to be thought through thoroughly, but I do think there's a clear answer, and this is what I will conclude on. The union of Great Britain and Ireland, which was a pretty forced and unsatisfactory union, but it probably would have survived nevertheless if Home Rule all round had been implemented, or at least Home Rule for Ireland in the first instance. And it was prevented by unionists, and particularly conservative unionists, the tradition I now represent today, or have succeeded to, and that history has to be considered very extensively. And when the game was nearly up in 1918, when Sinn Féin swept aside the Irish Nationalist Party, this polite force that had been saying, look, we win 90% of the seats in Ireland, we need home rule, give us home rule, we'll stay within Britain. Well, you know, the British state just never could deliver that. And then when Sinn Féin had this vast victory in 1918, the Unionists suddenly realised that unless something very dramatic happened, we would lose Ireland. And what did they produce? They produced federalism of a particularly coherent kind, actually, through the Speakers' Conference. There were two models, and one of them was a classic form of federalism in all but name. But they waited till the very last moment when it was far too late. It was probably a generation too late then to save the Union. And I just think if the people of Scotland vote yes to independence next year, but that happens because a lot of the middle ground in Scotland not really wanting independence as a first option, but are so unsatisfied with the current status quo that they end up voting for independence because a coherent alternative in some form of federalism is not offered to them. And I hope that Unionists this time don't miss the bus. I hope I've not gone on too long, Peter.
Thank you, David. That's very helpful to set the terms of the debate. Adam.
Well, I think I'm going to be very nice about David. That's probably going to do no good to either of our political reputations, but there we are. Seeing as you were nice you were kind in passing about me in part of the book. I think it's a very important, timely contribution. I mean, I think we need better unionists. I mean, and I say that as a nationalist. Wales needs better unionists. We all need to raise our game, I think, in politics in Wales, and that's true of nationalism as well. But so I welcome this contribution. I mean, I previously described David as the Voltaire of Wales, you know, rather grandly, as I want to do, Leighton. But I think
we'll finish me off.
I think that what he's avoided actually is what the more Panglossian versions of unionism, that this is the best of all possible states, the United Kingdom and Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which I don't think even the most hardline unionists in the room would necessarily agree with. Dismal unionism, you call it, and your vision of an exhilarating unionism, I mean, left me a little bit cold, I must admit. I'm as agnostic about that as I am in church, but I think it's a good effort to try and create a different vision of what Britain could be. Because when we talk about the national question, we often get stuck about who we are. But actually, the real question is, what do we want to be? What is Wales for, and what is Britain for? I think are the more interesting questions. Because everything else is pure subjectivity. We can have an interesting dialogue about that question, about who we what kind of society we want to be. I think that where I do agree with him. I mean, David is a bit like as Gwyneth Williams once said of Saunders Lewis. It's a pleasure disagreeing with him, but I do agree with him on this central question. The Scottish question is a question for all of us, as Peter said as well. And, the way in which this debate, Wales and Northern Ireland have been gently airbrushed out of the picture. It's a kind of an Anglo-Scottish dialogue, I think, is very, very dangerous and unacceptable, because there will be consequences of a yes or a no vote for all of us within this supposedly United Kingdom. So I think that's very, very important. I mean, it's sometimes I think sometimes the sloganizing of better together, which, they kind of lapse into this rather hackneyed kind of divorce kind of analogy sometimes. Well, if it's a divorce, there are 4 people in this marriage, and not even the most liberal Cameroon, I think, would be in favour of that. So presumably then we're the children, the hapless children upstairs, kind of cowering as the constitutional crockery of state is smashed to smithereens. Well, that's not acceptable, is it? It reminds me a little bit of the home championships, when after 100 years of solid service to the Union was dispatched with unceremoniously because the English lost interest and the Scottish followed suit. And if I remember rightly, with great irony, of course, it was the Northern Irish that won that year and Wales came second. And it's still up there, presumably, in the Irish FA in Belfast. So I think that we need a referendum all round. We all need to ask, maybe the question might be different. Certainly the answers, I hope, will be different. But we all, I think, need to engage in a dialogue about where we want to be. The English need to have a debate. I mean, you know, this English patriotism is the love that dare not speak its name. It seems to me. It reminds me a little bit of the last days of the, dare I say, the Habsburg Empire, when they conjured up this because they couldn't use the word Austria. Austria wasn't used as a term officially until 1915, a bit late in the day, I suggest, you know. So they created this Ruritanian term for the German-speaking parts of Austria-Hungary, Cisleithania. Hasn't really left its mark on history, but I think the English are somewhere in that Cisleithanian realm, you know. They haven't even begun to ask the national question, certainly not in the same depth and rigour that you know, David's book attests to the degree with which we've asked it in Wales. I remain an ethical nationalist. That is, I believe that no country ever ruled another well. And I'm sure we can have an argument about that. But my general view, as a kind of my global Whig view of history, David, is that the history of the 20th century and the 21st century has been one of submerged and subaltern peoples that are now beginning to take full possession of their future. And I hope that Wales will join them one day, though I don't discount the very real practical difficulties of, not least because of our own impoverishment, that are in the way of that. But that's where I'd like to go. But, you know, inherently, politics, identity, it's a very subjective thing. But let's ask this question about what is Britain for? You know, when I was born, my father worked for the National Coal Board. There were British, UK-wide institutions, you know, British Steel, British Rail. What happened? Labour and Conservative governments actually led to the demise of those UK-wide institutions. 1945 maybe was a vision of an alternative Britain that could have been, but it was snuffed out of existence. And that's why I and my family, we pitched our tent in a different political field.
Thank you, Andy.